The Lord be with you. A reading from the Holy Gospel according to Matthew. After he had fed the people, Jesus made the disciples get into a boat and precede him to the other side, and while he dismissed the crowds. After doing so, he went up the mountain by himself to pray. When it was evening, he was there alone. Meanwhile, the boat, already a few miles offshore, was being tossed about by the waves, for the wind was against it. During the fourth watch of the night, he came toward them, walking on the sea. When the disciples saw him walking on the sea, they were terrified. "It is a ghost," they said, and they cried out in fear. Once Jesus spoke to them, "Take courage, it is I. Do not be afraid." Peter said to him in reply, "Lord, if it is you, command me to come to you on the water." He said, "Come." Peter got out of the boat and began to walk on the water toward Jesus. But when he saw how strong the wind was, he became frightened, and beginning to sink, he cried out, "Lord, save me." Immediately Jesus stretched out his hand and caught Peter, and said to him, "O you of little faith, why did you doubt?" After they got into the boat, the wind died down. Those who were in the boat did him homage, saying, "Truly, you are the Son of God." The Gospel of the Lord.
Praise to you, Lord.
I oftentimes wonder if Jesus' disciples were to recount their experiences of following Jesus day after day, if they might say that every day was an adventure. Every day brought something unexpected. They never knew when a crisis arose that Jesus had to deal with, or they themselves had to deal with for that matter as well. One day, lepers might appear, asking for help. The next day, someone's son or servant died. Last week, they were asked to feed a crowd of well over 5,000 people, with only a few loaves of bread and some fish. Today, they find themselves on the Sea of Galilee when a ferocious storm comes across the lake, threatening to sink the boat and they in it. There's never a dull time, I think they could say, following Jesus. However, the constant through it all is really the hands of Jesus. The hands of Jesus to touch, to heal, and to help all those going through difficult times. His hands blessed bread and fish, which fed not only the thousands, but were enough leftovers to fill 12 large baskets. His hands reached out to save Peter from drowning, and his hands can reach out to pull us through the crisis of our lives if we are willing to allow him to catch us. The people of biblical times certainly did have their share of crisis in which they needed a helping hand. And God was there for them to reach out and help them through the crisis. In today's gospel, the apostles were fearful of the sea and believed that there were creatures under the water seeking to devour them. There was only death and destruction below those waters. And if you ever saw the movie The Perfect Storm, you would know that their fears were real. You may recall that Jesus was praying when his disciples were being tossed about by the waves by a storm. They are at their wits' end, exhausted in their struggle just to keep the boat from sinking. It was at the fourth watch, or well into the night, when all human strength is spent, when Jesus amazingly walks toward them on the water. How can this be possible? His appearance didn't calm their fears, it only heightened them, since they were not only afraid of drowning, but now they were afraid of the being coming toward them. And yet, as terrified as they were, they still recognized the voice of Jesus, assuring them, as he says, "Take courage, do not be afraid, it is I." Well, that's not enough for them. Peter accepts Jesus' invitation to jump in and come toward him. And all is fine until Peter recognizes that the winds are very strong and he becomes afraid, and which causes him to sink. Jesus extends a hand to save him, but at the same time says to him, "You of little faith, why did you doubt?" As Jesus gets into the boat, the winds calm down and the disciples are saved. And this becomes a real turning point in the lives of their disciples in understanding who Jesus was. He truly was the master of the waves and the waters. In fact, he is the Lord of all. His power far exceeds that of any human power. And without a doubt, this is a sign of his divinity and authority. And their response is to proclaim that Jesus is the Son of God. Well, in this instance, Jesus not only eases their fears, but also increases their understanding of him. In the first reading, Elisha also had his share of crisis. His prophetic ministry was certainly a stormy one, and we get a glimpse of that in that first reading. King Ahab had married Jezebel, who was determined to destroy the holy shrines of Israel and erect shrines to her god, Baal. Elijah had come to proclaim God's word so successfully to the people that the queen was enraged, and he was forced to flee for his life. And while on the run, he began to have doubts. He thought he was a failure, and that God no longer supported his mission. Well, just as Jesus did not abandon his disciples, God does not abandon Elijah. As Elijah goes to Mount Horeb, God sustains him along the way with bread and water. And at Mount Horeb, God comforts this forlorn prophet, not with mighty works such as wind or earthquake or fire, but with a tiny, tiny voice. Some might translate as the voice of silence. He experiences that silence, and we are told he covers his face because he realized he was in the presence of God. If this COVID-19 crisis teaches us anything, it teaches us that we are not immune from the hardships of life, And today's gospel, I think, really speaks to us of the times in which there are crises in our lives that threaten to take us under. As a people of faith, we look forward to a time when this pandemic storm is finally over. But in the meantime, we need to focus our eyes on Jesus, who walks with us on troubled waters. He alone can calm the storms of life, the storms of doubt, fear, and even desperation within us. And out of these difficult times, we, like the disciples, can proclaim, truly, you are the Son of God. As I look back on these past few months, I can honestly say that I really did need the hand of Jesus to help me through this crisis, and still do. The darkest time of that period, I think, was shortly after we were told to close down the parish. There would be no mass, no school, no gatherings of any sort, and we were confined to our homes unless absolutely necessary. Well, I was at a loss as to how to proceed, since this had never happened to me before, and there were no books, no experts to consult. And I think we can all say we were in a sense blind. And I admit that my two basic concerns at this time was, first of all, concern for you and all the parishioners, since I could neither communicate or see you as I once had. I worried about your health, especially your mental health, because I realized that if many of you were confined at the home, like I was, you were probably going stir crazy. The other concern was well-being for the parish, because the collection from those early weeks averaged less than $1,000, and yet there were still bills to be paid. I needed a helping hand if I were to get through this crisis. Then I recalled an old story about a man who lived on the banks of a river. Unexpectedly, the rains came and the waters of the river began to rise, and rise. Soon the man was forced to abandon the first floor of his house and retreat to the second floor. But then the waters still kept coming, and he was forced to sit on top of his roof, waiting for help to arrive. And almost immediately, a neighbor came in a canoe and offered to take him to safety. But the man declined, saying that he was waiting for God to save him. Then came a sheriff's patrol boat and likewise offered to assist him, and again he declined. He was waiting for God. Finally, a Coast Guard helicopter came and threw down a lifeline for him, but again he declined because he was waiting for God to save him. Well, the waters continued to rise, and eventually he drowned. And when he got to heaven, the first question he asked God was, "Why didn't you save me, God? I trusted you, and you let me down." But God replied, "I tried, and you refused. I sent you a neighbor, a sheriff's rescue boat, and even the Coast Guard, and you refused them all." Well, as I remembered this story, I tried to avoid being that particular person. And instead, I began to look at all the ways God was extending a hand out to me during this difficult time. And I found some rather interesting ways in which God extended his hand. The first was through prayer. I needed to go to God, shake my fist at him and say, "Why are you doing this to us?" And yet I found tremendous comfort in the Mass. Granted, I was the only one in the room, but somehow I felt the entire parish with me. I also felt comfort in the Rosary. I would generally begin at our grotto and walk around the parish grounds, and by the time the Rosary was complete, I was back at the grotto. And my prayers weren't for myself, but for all of you and for those suffering from this virus. Next, I had tremendous support from this parish community. Even though I remained here on the grounds, I certainly appreciated all the phone calls, notes, and occasional drop-in visits from many of you, wondering how I was doing and if there was anything I could do. I was also appreciative of the many meals dropped off at my door, because I realized how bad of a cook I really was. I also appreciate the support of various parish committees that I relied on for help and guidance during this time. Again, we didn't know how to proceed or where to go from here. And yet it was through these committees that helped give me guidance. And Zoom was one way in which we could communicate with various committees safely via the internet. I'm also appreciative of how many of you stepped forward to up your financial support of the parish. As I mentioned earlier, we almost had no money coming in to the parish, but that didn't stop the bills from coming in. Then we began to see larger donations coming in with notes that read, "I know the parish isn't open, but I still want to help." I was also heartened by a few people who came to me and said, "I don't need all this stimulus money I received. Why don't you take it and give it to someone in need?" Well, with that money, we were able to help a family who had a house fire that was burned out, and we partnered with the VFW to provide food and personal items until they were able to become a little more steady on their feet. We also helped 2 of our school families because of job losses. I'm also grateful for the Knights of Columbus for stepping forward and helping us with the opening of the Sunday Mass. When I got the notice that we could open up the Mass under certain guidelines and restrictions, my first thought was, this is impossible. We can't open up. We can't do it. And certainly for one person, it was impossible, and certainly is. However, the Knights stepped forward and divvied up the work, and here we are. This shows me how badly we miss the Mass and how much we are willing to pitch in to make it happen. And so whether you knew it or not, you played an important role in keeping and helping me keep my sanity during these frightful days. And finally, I think my dog was really a hand coming from God stretched out to me. Because when I got tense and anxious during those times, the dog seemed to sense that and give me that, "We gotta go outside now, look." And it gave me a chance to get out, take a deep breath, and then return to what I was doing. I know that there are still dark days ahead, with the reopening up of school, with the next wave of the virus, and whatever else comes our way. But today's readings afford us hope that we are never alone. Jesus shares in our anxiety and our fears. He is not only in our boat, but he is the captain of our boat, leading us to safe harbor. And he reminds us, courage. Do not be afraid, for I am with you. During these times of crisis, we can learn from Elijah that God comes to us in some rather surprising ways. Maybe not in mighty storms, but in silence. Our gospel reminds us that we may find ourselves in a hurricane sea that leaves us in a cold sweat over a crisis. But Jesus reassures us with his presence. He comes to us, walking on the water in order to get into our boat and calm those seas. Yes, there never is a dull day with Jesus in our boat. But now, more than ever before, we need him. We need him to come walking toward us and calming the storms of our lives.